the stream is starting.
Mm-hmm. Good.
And thank you for joining the project in general. And probably Astrid will tell you, but we are going to have a conference to wind it up in Lviv, and probably will invite your company to join us, at least online. Unfortunately, we can't allow ourselves to invite people to Ukraine these days, but yeah. Okay, so we are online. Just a few words. Thanks everyone who has joined us, and I'm really sorry for some technical issues and being late. It was my fault, and I had no internet connection. So we are really grateful that you have waited for us and you are with us at the moment. So I want to thank the Embassy of America in Ukraine for supporting this really important project, Bordering to Bordering, Rebordering. And today I want to thank Beryl Slimberg. Am I right, Beryl? Sorry if I have not.
Beryl.
Sorry, my second language is French, so sometimes I have problems with German. So Beryl is a candidate in North American Literary and Cultural Studies at Saarland University. And today we talk about frontier, from frontier to border studies is the topic of our today's lecture. So changing approaches to borders in the American West. Thank you, Beryl, for participation in the project and for giving lecture for Ukrainian viewers. And the floor is yours, but I want to remind our viewers to leave their questions so that Beryl could be able to answer them in the end of at the end of the lecture. If you have any questions or any remarks you want to share with us, please do it in the comments under this video. So, Beryl, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thanks for having me. Can you see my screen? I shared that. Is that working?
Yes, we can see. Yeah, it's working.
Good. Okay. So as you heard already, my talk is called From Frontier to Border Studies, Changing Approaches to Borders in the American West. So what am I going to do and what can you expect from this talk? I will give a very brief historical introduction to the background of westward expansion in the US. I apologize to everyone who is in American Studies or who is a historian and board. I keep this brief just that we have a common ground to start from, because I'm aware that not everyone is in American Studies and not everyone is an expert on the 19th century westward expansion of the US. So that's why I included that. Afterwards, I introduce you to changing approaches to borders in the American West. I will give you some details on Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis, the famous and notorious one. Then I will come to criticism on the frontier thesis, because from our perspective today, this is highly problematic. And I will give you some recent approaches like critical regionalism and border studies. And we'll then come to an example of one novel and one film, or a TV series to be more precise, which I will then kind of make an example of what you can do with these approaches. First of all, I'd like to draw your attention to what do we mean when we talk about the West, as if it were one singular unit. It isn't. Westward expansion happened from early settlements onwards, and the main part, as you can see in the maps in a second, was happening in the 19th century. And I'm talking about English-speaking colonies here because I'm in American studies and my languages are English. I have some Spanish and some French, but I'm not concentrating on French settlements or Spanish settlements, but I will kind of consider them in some respects as well. And what you have to be aware of that for a very long time, history was told from a white European, that is mostly male settler perspective. So that formed the hegemonic narrative or the mainstream narrative of what happened in the US. If you looked at a history book in the 1970s, you still had Columbus discovered America and then settlement began. And the problem with this perspective is that it ignores Native American inhabitants. It also ignores other ethnic groups. We will come to the southern border also in a few seconds. So there were Mexican Americans living there, and the border just crossed them. So they became part of the United States without doing anything, just by moving borders. And this is a problem with this perspective, that it's so multi-dimensional, monovocal. It's a real problem. So here are some dates. You don't need to remember them, just a very rough, basic introduction. So 1770s till 1790s, you had the first settlements across the Appalachian Mountains. So at that time, the West was still very much close to the East Coast. 1787, the Northwest Ordinance, that's the part below the Great Lakes when you look at a map today, which became part of the US at that time. Then you have the Louisiana Purchase, 1803. I'll show you a map in a second. That's a huge chunk of land which was bought from France and which nearly doubled the territory of the United States. You have the Lewis and Clark expedition shortly afterwards because that land needed to be mapped, and the two guys, Lewis and Clark, were hired by the President Jefferson at the time to map the territory and to also describe nature, to describe native inhabitants, but also to kind of have comments on flora, fauna, whatever was there, rivers, mountains. So they went from St. Louis to the Pacific. Something else more connected to the southern border is the Mexican-American War, which also increased the territory of the US. When the US won that war in 1848, you have the Gadsden Purchase, which is a relatively small piece of land at the southern border in what is today Arizona mainly. So that kind of concluded the territorial growth. And then you have something else, not a war, not a kind of purchase of land, but the California Gold Rush in 1849, which also had a huge pull factor for people moving west. Here are some maps. So you have what is brown here on the right side, the part of the original 13 colonies plus newly acquired territories at that time, or states at the time of American independence. So 1876 was the Declaration of Independence. 1783 is usually the time when the independence was completed. The part up north here, if you can see my my kind of drawer, that is what was added by the Northwest Ordinance, as I told you a few seconds ago, so 1787. The white part in the middle here is the Louisiana Purchase, 1803, bought from France. The turquoise one down south here is the Texas annexation. So you had U.S. settlers in that area, and they kind of raged smaller conflicts, which became larger in the end towards the Mexican Americans living there. And then after the Mexican American War, that territory was also finally added. It was kind of annexed in 1845, but the final decision was after the Mexican American War. The Mexican concession is what was added after the war, kind of by financial disadvantage to Mexico. So they ceded off this part of the land, and the Gadsden Purchase is the smaller part directly below in that orange color, which kind of completed the territorial growth. This is just for your information with kind of today's state, so that you can see what is today's Texas, what is today's state line in Texas annexation territory, or what is the Mexican cession or the Louisiana Purchase. So you see lots of states involved. I already mentioned the Texas annexation, Mexican-American War, and the Gadsden Purchase. You saw that on that map before. I explained that already. Here you have the dates just for completeness. And this kind of is the end of my historical context. I hope that was not boring people still to know all this, but I think it's necessary for what I'm going to talk about now. So in 1890, the so-called frontier, so the line of settlement, where kind of what was considered settled territory and unsettled territory. As I said, this is ignoring Native American inhabitants and their right to the land. That frontier line was announced to be closed in 1890. This means that the United States become a nation covering the North American continent from Atlantic to Pacific coast. What was next was that the United States, as a relatively young nation state, and I'm really talking about the state here, so I'm not talking about the history of America is not older. I'm talking about the United States as an independent state and that territory, and especially when you have a different form and they freed themselves from the colonial past and from their ties to the English crown, and they needed to establish certain national narratives and myths to do that. And one thing that was highly regarded in that remark is the concept of exceptionalism. This dates back to early settlers with first of all religious context. So you have the Mayflower and the Mayflower Compact, where they already state that this is an example for other people. You have the concept of the city upon a hill, so kind of the landmark, which is a kind of example for others. This comes from the religious background of early settlers and is then also transferred to the political system, so that you have a democratic state as an example for the spread of democracy all over the world. The second concept I'd like to mention here is that of manifest destiny, which is the belief that the United States had the right, but are also required to expand their territory from coast to coast. This is connected to the concept of exceptionalism, and the term as such was first introduced by journalist John O'Sullivan, who in an essay asked for the Texas annexation, and in that context, he coined that term so that you have a certain requirement to do certain things, but also the right to do so. Again, all of this is a white settler perspective and to a large extent ignoring Native American rights. I want to make that clear. So when I talk about historical concepts and certain ideas in history, does not mean that I agree with that or that I'm happy with that, but this is a description of certain phenomena. Here you can see a picture by John Gass, the painting, which is usually seen as a kind of exemplification of the concept of manifest destiny. So you have a painting of an allegorical figure in the middle. So the woman in white is usually seen as Columbia, so the allegorical figure of the United States. And she is meant to bring progress. So she has a book under her arm, so that's education, and she has a telephone or telegram at that time, probably cable in her hand, and kind of brings that from, if you would read the picture as comparable to a map, that would be from east to west. You can also see that the light is kind of different. So you have darker colors on the left side and lighter ones on the right side. That's also probably, or at least that was read usually as kind of a sign of enlightenment and progress coming from east to west. And you also have the kind of railroad in the background here. So kind of also connecting the land, and you have coaches and trails with settlers. What is also present is farming, and certain men, or at least I see them as men here, kind of moving also westward. And at least one of them has a shovel, so that can be mining, that can also be other things. You have a gun here, so the violence is included. A group of Native Americans seems to be fleeing from the newly arriving people. And you also have animals, which are also pushed further to the margin, or the margin of the picture at least. So you have buffaloes in the back and a bear in the front. This is what I already said, just as a kind of reminder. So this is a painting by John Gass, 1872. And the title of the painting is American Progress, not Manifest Destiny, but it's usually seen as a kind of illustration of that concept. So the frontier was closed, and shortly afterwards, in 1893, something took place in Chicago, a World Fair. Was called Columbian Exhibition, and it was, as I said, that's shortly after independence. So you can see that the United States are still looking for images and kind of trying to celebrate themselves. They have established an independent state, but nevertheless, they're probably still searching for an identity, and they want to celebrate the United States and present, as I said, this is a world fair, as the name suggests, so you have visitors from all over the world, and you present everything from agriculture to cultural products. At that World Fair text, the significance of the frontier in American history, which was a paper or a speech presented in 1893 at a meeting of the American Historical Society. And that made his name. He published it shortly afterwards as a paper and then incorporated it later in an extended version in his book, The Frontier in American History. That was his main topic and something he came back to again and again and again. I include some quotes here to show you some aspects which are important in that thesis. As I said, this is presenting historical footage, and you should be aware that there are many problematic aspects in that text. The first one is already one. So the frontier is the outer edge of the wave, the meeting point between savagery and civilization. So you have a distinction kind of, privileging white settler society over Native American ones by kind of describing that as savagery. So Native American cultures and their right to the land were ignored by Turner and by others in that time. What makes the kind of thesis so attractive in that time is kind of the fact that he connects the point of moving west and kind of encountering the frontier with concept of Americanization. So, quote, "The frontier is the line of the most rapid and effective Americanization. The wilderness masters the colonist. It finds him a European interests, industries, tools." Sorry. Modes of travel and thought. And little by little, he transforms the wilderness, but the outcome is not the old Europe. Oh, gosh. All right. The fact is that here is a new product that is American. So by moving west, the European settlers or the Americans from the East Coast settling the West become American. That's the basic idea of that thesis, and I think that's the main aspect which was attractive for most people who bought into that for a very long time. Let me now see, can I make this smaller? Yeah, good. At first, the frontier was the Atlantic coast, the frontier of Europe in a very real sense. Moving westward, the frontier became more and more American, as successive terminal moraines result from successive classinations, so each frontier leaves its traces behind it, and when it becomes a settled area, the region still partakes of the frontier characteristics. Thus, the advance of the frontier has meant a steady movement away from the influence of Europe, a steady growth of independence on American lines. So you have a kind of cutting the ties to your European roots and becoming independent Americans and identifying and establishing an American identity. This is also something that is important. The American frontier is sharply distinguished from the European frontier, a fortified boundary line running through dense populations. The most significant thing about the American frontier is that it lies at the hither edge of free land. Again, this is completely ignoring Native American rights, so the land was never free or empty. There were people living there, but violent European settlers or American settlers moving west kind of pushed them further and further to the west and to reservations. They killed many of them in conflicts that might not have been the big wars by states like in Europe, but the outcome was the same. So people were killed, and this was not a nice thing to happen. Turner ideas were important for a very long time. So you still have the myth and symbol school, a group in American studies in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, which still went back to Turner and kind of underlined his importance. For example, Henry Nash Smith in his Virgin Land, American Myth, the American West as Symbol and Myth from 1950 has this kind of comment here. Man of Thomas Jefferson's day emphasized freedom and republicanism as the defining characteristics of American society. The definitions of later thinkers stress the cosmopolitan blending of 100 peoples into one, or mechanical ingenuity or devotion to business enterprise. But one of the most persistent generalizations concerning American life and character is the notion that our society has been shaped by the pull of a vacant continent drawing populations westward through the passes of the Alleghenies, across the Mississippi Valley, over the high plains and mountains of the far west to the Pacific coast. So you see that this frontier thesis was important for a very long time, and I already says it's highly problematic for some aspects, especially, and that was the main points of criticism when it was finally criticized in the 1960s and later. The points of criticism were that the presentation included a very violent masculinity. It included violence in general. It included racism, and it kind of misrepresented or showed a problematic treatment of Native Americans. Criticism also made suggestions how things can be put in better ways, and did not stop at negative criticism. And that's why I would like to make the transition to the other approaches I'd like to mention, and that I would also like to apply to my examples later on. The first one is feminist literary scholar Annette Kolodny, and she had an article which was basically introduction to a book she edited that is called Letting Go Our Grand Obsessions, Notes Towards a New Literary History of the American Frontiers. In that article, she redefines the term frontier by using the plural, first of all. She says frontiers, so it's not a monolithic line moving from east to west, and that's it. So she has different ones, which makes it her concept closer to what, for example, Gloria Anzaldúa has in her Borderlands approach. So here are some quotes. I included the DOI, so the text is freely available. You can read up on that. It's from 1992, so a little dated, but nevertheless, this was one step which was important at the time to do. So here are two quotes. What makes the paradigm so appealing is that English texts by themselves could never constitute a sufficient history. So she asked for including of Native American voices, Spanish voices, French voices, other voices. So she asked for inclusion of Asian American immigrant stories, and also immigrant stories different from European ones. Second quote, to establish a truly comprehensive frontier literary history, both geography and chronology must be viewed as fluid and ongoing, or as a continually unfolding palimpsest. So layer over layer, and that's what I would like to come back to later. Two more quotes. By acknowledging the many different configurations of indigenous peoples, immigrants and emigrants who came in contact over time on a variety of landscapes, we allow the literatures of the frontier to stand accurately at last as multilingual, polyvocal, and newly intertextual and multicultural. So she says, go away from the one white settler perspective and present, in her case, literary history because she's a literary critic. But in parallel, there was also something like New Historicism beginning in the 1990s with of a new generation of historians asking for changes there as well. Next quote, by understanding the frontier as a specifiable first moment on that liminal borderland between distinct cultures, we forever decenter what was previously a narrow Eurocentric design. So she asked for a decentering of certain aspects. She has the borderland terminology included here. She asked for different cultures to be seen and heard and included in certain narratives, which also goes away from one monolithic national narrative, if you want to call it like that. Last quote from Kolodny is her kind of reinterpretation of literary histories. I'm asking that we once and for all eschew the myth of origins with its habit of either fetishizing or marginalizing race, place, and ethnicity, and by returning to serious study of the frontier, adopt a model of history that privileges no group's priority and no region's primacy. In the frontier literary history I have projected here, there can be no landscape because there are so many borderlands, and over time, even the same site may serve as seriatim first encounters. There can be no single overarching history. So what was presented for a very long time, the white male settler perspective, needs to be one of many stories and cannot be prioritized anymore. Similar arguments, but from a historian's point of view, is Eric Randin's The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America, where he also says, quote, the ideal of the frontier contained within itself the terms of its own criticism, which is another reason why it serves as so powerful a national metaphor. Martin Luther King Jr. argued that the ideal fed into multiple reinforcing pathologies. into racism, a violent masculinity, and moralism that celebrated the rich and punished the poor. So he traces the frontier and the problematic it brings along in American history, and kind of in Grandin's argument, the same ideas that were prevalent in the frontier thesis now kind of feed into the idea of the border wall to Mexico, which Trump, for example, advertised. Someone else connecting to the ideas of the frontier is another historian, Richard Slatkin. He's best known for a trilogy of books, the first one, 1973, the second one, 1985, and the third one, 1992. So here are the covers. You have Regeneration Through Violence, the mythology of the American frontier, 1600 to 1860, and then The Fatal Environment, the myth of the frontier in the age of industrialization, so 1800 till 1890. And finally, Gunfighter Nation, the myth of the frontier in 20th century America, where he comes to something which will also be shown in my examples, when you see the kind of cultural impact of certain ideas in cultural products until today. Here's a quote from the last book, so the 20th century one, in which he describes, quote, the Wild West wrote history by conflating it with mythology. The reenactments were not recreations, but reductions of complex event into typical scenes, presenting its landscapes as a mythic space in which past and present, fiction and reality could coexist, a space in which history translated into myth was reenacted as ritual. So the repeatedness of certain ideas, the imaginary factor of certain landscapes, the mythical space of what we all fancy as Western, in a US context, can be seen as something that's typical in cultural products and something which is repeated by the imaginary connected to a Wild West or the Old West. I will come to that in a second. Neil Campbell is a cultural critic, a cultural studies person, has also an introduction to cultural studies in an American studies context, and he has several books on the West, for example, the rhizomatic West or post-Westerns, where he looks at certain aspects, and this is, you can either see that as post-Western studies or as critical regional studies, where he says that, quote, the origin story of the United States was solidified in the Western, materialized in the actions of its heroes and villains, and naturalized through its specific geomystical symbolic locations. Its apparently progressive linear history, intimately associated with Frederick Jackson Turner's lucid, expansive frontier line moving inexorably across from east to west, epitomized the inevitable narrative sequence and logical language of internal colonization's nation-making process. So here you have a description of why the Western is so important for certain aspects and why he was popular, and what's also problematic about that, and also the internal colonization, so the pushing Native Americans away from areas and marginalizing them and colonizing them and putting them into reservations. Susan Colleen is another post-Western critic or critical regional critic, has several books on post-Western cultures, for example, on the history of Western American literature. That's something she edited, or Captivating Westerns, where she looks at the Middle East in the American West. And from the Post-Western Cultures book, the introduction has two quotes I'd like to mention here as kind of a starting point for my examples then. So one is, the region not as closed or bounded space, but as a continually changing and evolving entity in both content and form. So the region is not something fixed. It's not something that is one-dimensional. It's also not something where you can say, okay, this is the exact definition and the region runs exactly from here to here and that's it. No, the same goes for borders. Borders might be a line in the sand, but actually you have border discourses which are influential. You have certain rules and regulations which restrict access or which allow access, and all of that is represented in border studies. Second quote here is kind of emerging critical approach. Post-Western studies work against a narrowly conceived regionalism, one that restricts Western cultures of the past and present to some predetermined entity with static borders and boundaries. So this is again kind of saying that borders and boundaries are not static. You can look at different times, you can look at different locations, and they are changing. And it's also, even if a border is geographically fixed at a certain time, it might be different for depending on who encounters it, which passport you have. If you've been there or if you watched the recording of Tobias Schank's presentation from last week, where he talked about border texturing the Polish-German borderlands, I'd like to include that concept. So the concept of border textures or border texturing as a process, which is a concept that a working group named Border Textures developed. And there's an article by Fellner, Wille, Frank et al. And they define border textures as a fabric or consisting of different layers, as interwovenness, and border textures are discourses and cultural practices in borderlands. And I think that's the most important point, and that's also what I would like to come to in my examples. And you can also connect that back to the concepts I talked about before, so the critical regionalism, the Colleen example. I have one more quote after my examples in the end. So you can look at cultural products on different levels, so textual level, temporal level, generic level, symbolic level, or epistemological level. There might be more. They're interwoven. It's not one thread from A to B, but different ones. This is a mix. And I like to apply that to a novel and a TV series, very briefly, kind of giving you a glimpse at what you can do with these concepts. And the novel I would like to mention is Erland Diaz' 2017 publication, In the Distance. Was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, did not win it, but it's a great book. So if you have the chance to read it, do that. And I'm fully aware that presentations on novels might be problematic if no one has read that. So I give you the kind of plot in one sentence. There are two Swedish brothers in the 19th century from Sweden who emigrate to the United States. On the way, they're kind of separated, and one ends up in New York. Supposedly, we never hear of him again. And the other one is by accident kind of emigrating from the Californian coast side and tries to go back east to meet with his brother. So this is kind of on a textual level, border texturing different stories, perspectives, interwovenness in the story. You have a temporal level, you have the past, you have the present, maybe also the future. That's the plot. You also have kind of a recent novel going back to the United States in the 19th century. So this is a historical novel to some extent. You have generic interwovenness. You can see that story as a Western, at least most parts of it. You can see it as a migration story. You can also see it as a historical novel. There's a mix. You have symbolic elements which are interwoven, which are connected to borders and border crossings. When do you become something? When is your identity built? How do you identify in certain systems? And you also have epistemological aspects in that story. I just want to give you one quote, which kind of gives you the idea how place is treated in the story. So this is from The Relative End. Wait, the boy cried. Where are you going? West, said Harkin. That's the main character. The boy looked confused. What west? Now I may be able to walk over the sea, otherwise next winter. Then a straight line west to Sweden. So he wants to basically go back to, he ends up in Alaska and kind of could walk over to Russia when the ice is frozen in winter, and then he wants to go back to Sweden. So his kind of migration story comes full circle, or might come full circle. It's open. You never know what happens next. And so directions and location is relatively, it's relativized. So the West he dreamt of did not become the dream he was thinking it would be. He had a hard life in the United States. Some parts not unhappy, but others were unhappy, and at least he did not strike it rich. So his dreams as a boy might not have become true. So he's going back to Sweden, where he originated from. The second example is a TV series, Westworld. And I just want to come back to the different levels which you could look at. So you have, it's about a Wild West theme park. You have different plot layers, a team in the background who scripts the story of the Wild West park, and then kind of the visitors of the park who enact scenes in the Old West, and then you have kind of robots who act as the inhabitants of the park. And so you have different textual levels, you have different temporal levels that the robots should not remember past lives, so they are kind of renovated from time to time, but some of them can remember them, and some of them have certain glitches, and that's kind of making the story interesting. Generic, you have a mix between Western, sci-fi, maybe utopia or dystopia. You can decide that for yourself. There are symbolic elements included, and naturally also epistemological. And now I have two pictures where you see kind of how the landscape of the park is reminiscent of what you expect in a Western show. So the visitors can really enact the Wild West. They can also engage in violent acts because the robots are meant to have, no real life. They can be killed if you want to. So here you have also questions of what is life, what is worth being considered moral, what is not moral. And this is, at least for me, who knows some Westerns, kind of the typical Western landscape. And you see the kind of shooting here. I'd like to close with two quotes, one by Stephen Tatum, another post-Western critic. He has coined, or he has mentioned, the term post-Western horizons and says, quote, places and region are not only geopolitical and geological territories or physical landscapes, but also as sites produced by the circulation of peoples, of technologies and commodities, and of cultural artifacts, including, of course, images, stories, and myths. So the importance of cultural products, like the two ones I showed you, is highlighted here. So for our imagination and for our concepts, which we have of certain territories or landscapes or places, cultural products which represent them are important. People who have never been to the American West at least have an image of it. If that's kind of good or bad thing is something you need to decide. And the very last quote is from a book by Eric Savoy on frontier Gothic. And that's kind of stressing the temporal aspect again. So the past constantly inhabits the present, where progress generates an almost unbearable anxiety about its costs, and where an insatiable appetite for spectacles of grotesque violence is part of the texture of everyday reality. So he stresses and highlights kind of the past, which is hushed up, but which is nevertheless haunting the present, and which is there all the time. And even if you try to ignore certain past events, like the mistreatment and killing of Native American inhabitants, or in Savoy's book, he also talks about the system of slavery kind of having problematic implications for future societies, and kind of haunting kind of society until today, and the kind of the very prevalent racism that's still inherent in society is connected to that, and to certain things which were never openly discussed and problematized. Thank you very much for your attention, and thanks for allowing me to go a little over time. So,
Thank you, Beryl. First of all, for the great presentation and for your patience while waiting. Personally, I want to thank you just regarding the topic, because you have evoked some great memories from my past life when I used to teach literature, and together with Professor Wysocka, whose presentation was also included in this project, we used to teach a course connected with American mythology. And of course, we devoted a lot of time and everything to this concept of the frontier. And it's so great just to hear somebody looking at the same factual material, but from totally different point of view, and not always totally different, of course, but these connections and these differences just evoked a lot of great memories. And thank you for the advice what to read regarding the topic, because I just was looking for a new book and now I know what I'm looking for. So unfortunately, our viewers have not left any questions, probably because the evening is warm here and they want to go outside, or they have just not got any questions yet and have need some time to rethink what you've mentioned. And thank you once more, Birbal. I think we will stop here for today, but I'm sure it's not the end.
Thank
And
you.
really-
I'm perfectly fine. And I know that this was a lot input. I mean, if someone talks for 45 minutes or 48 to be more precise, then it's hard to come up with questions. I'm happy if someone has questions afterwards. Feel free to get in touch, forward my email, and people can just get in touch if they come up with a question later on. And if not, I'm also, the weather is also nice here outside. So I can also imagine to sit in the sun a little. So I hope you have a nice evening.
Thank you. Have a nice evening too. Goodbye.
Bye.